Hello, my name is Forbes Walker. I am the University of Tennessee Extension Environmental Soil Specialist. Today we're going to be talking about regenerative ag, which is a relatively old term, but we're hearing a whole lot more about it in recent years. There's been a lot of talk about regenerative ag in the popular press and amongst the farming community. Big question is this the future of ag, or is it just a passing fad? Today, I'm going to give an outline of my presentation, talk a little bit about the definition and the history behind regenerative ag, some of the principles that are discussed when we talk about regenerative ag, what some of the scientific literature says, and some of the companies that are making bold statements about ensuring regenerative ag is part of the way they are producing their food. Then a little bit talk about some of regenerative ag in the different land-grant universities and what we're doing here at the University of Tennessee and some of the future initiatives that we may be involved with. Regenerative ag was actually first described way back in the 80s by the Rodale Institute, where they were talking about regenerative organic agriculture, really going a little bit beyond sustainable and looking at improving the soil. Not just sustainability, but improving the soil. They emphasized a lot of things about closing nutrient cycling loops, greater biological diversity, the use of perennials rather than annuals. Robert Rodale first discussed it in 1989 in a USDA interview, and they talked about 7 tendencies towards regeneration. They came up with couple of white papers, one in 2014, looking at regenerative organic agriculture and climate change, and more recently in 2020, talking about regenerative ag and the soil carbon solution. The graphics we've got on the side here are a couple of things from or a couple of statements from this 2020 white paper, where they're suggesting that the adoption of regenerative ag could sequester about 100% of the current CO2 emissions associated with human activities. And that graph at the bottom is also showing something like that. The work of regenerative ag in recent years kind of builds very much on the work of Alan Savory. He's a scientist who started working in Zimbabwe in the 1950s and 60s and looked at overstocking and grazing habits of the great grasslands of the world, especially in Africa was where he was. He's since moved to New Mexico and got a center for called the Savory Institute in New Mexico. He's kind of interesting to know he had a TED talk we gave in 2013 on this. It's had over 8 million views, and now his organization, the Savory Institute, has got a verification program linking buyers who wish to buy regeneratively produced products to regenerative farmers. I should say that a lot of the basis for this work is around the ecological literature, where there's the grasses of the Great Plains, the grasses of great ecosystems like the Serengeti ecosystem in East Africa. The grass is very much co-evolved with the animals that graze on them, and the act of grazing will actually stimulate the production of the grasses. So definition of regenerative ag, it's very difficult to come up with a good definition of regenerative ag because there's no one entity has come out with one. USDA, for example, really doesn't define the regenerative ag. Here I've got an example of the what General Mills has come up with. We'll see in a couple of slides later that General Mills made some bold statements a few years ago, but basically what they're saying is that regenerative ag doesn't fit all sizes. So basically a regenerative ag farm in Tennessee is going to look quite different from some of the practices that they do in Texas, which is going to look quite different from some of the practices they may do in Washington state. Some of the practices they emphasize are minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing crop diversity, keeping the soil covered, whether it be with residue or with a growing crop, maintaining living roots, and integrating livestock into the system. Some people, when this definition first came out, would say, well, is this just rebranding of other things? If you look here, I've got the side-by-side comparison of the General Mills definition as well as what the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, describes as principles behind conservation agriculture: minimum mechanical soil disturbance, permanent soil cover, species diversification. Those are three principles used by the General Mills thing. So cynics will say, well, are we just rebranding something we're already doing? Is it just conservation ag with cover crops and animals, or is it soil health practices with manure? So we'll see what other definitions are. This is a paper that, or an article that was produced by the Soil Science Society of America, where they looked at different agricultural systems: sustainable ag, regenerative ag, conservation ag, climate smart ag, and organic ag. And you'll see there's a lot of similarities in the principles and practices, with emphasis on soil health, keeping the soil covered, minimizing soil disturbance, maintaining living roots, i.e. cover crops, diversifying the crop rotations, increasing soil carbon. So you can see across these different systems, there's a lot of similarities with the regenerative and conservation ag, and regenerative and climate smart ag, regenerative and sustainable ag. In terms of data that has been generated on regenerative ag, I always point to the Texas A&M folks in Vernon, in Texas, starting in the 1980s. Richard Teague, who's recently just retired, he started looking at the best management practices for grazeland management, and looking at different grazing strategies to see how it influenced carbon sequestration, soil fertility and stability, water quality, production, as well as economics. The system that they developed was called an adaptive multi-paddock grazing system. So rather than continuous grazing, they're moving animals in these multi-paddock systems. I also point to some nice videos that the Arizona State University, Peter Burke, has put together. It's actually the School of Journalism. And there are some anecdotes of different people in different parts of the United States practicing this multi-paddock approach, or regenerative ag, and see how that's working there. In terms of the literature, again, this is a paper that came out in the 2011 with Richard Teague, the group from Texas A&M, basically looking at grazing management impacts on different aspects of the soil. They found much better aggregate stability, higher soil organic matter and cation exchange capacity, higher fungal bacteria ratios in the paddock system contained with the continuous grazing system. Remember, a lot of these grasses co-evolve with some of the animals that are grazing. So the grazing does actually stimulate increased turnover of and cycling of the nutrients. This is a paper that they came up with in 2018, where they looked at the profitability and the economics, and they concluded that the increase in long-term profit on commercial scale ranches with this multi-paddock grazing system, it sustains ecological conditions with higher stocking numbers and was more beneficial under stocking under dry conditions. Here's a paper from other parts of the country. This is studies conducted in Minnesota and Pennsylvania. These are studies that just came out in 2020, and again, they show that grazing increased different enzyme activities, the availability of different nutrients: magnesium, calcium, nitrate, ammonium, changes in the soil pH, the amount of carbon, as well as the and sulfur produced. And they concluded that rotational grazing can increase soil quality and microbial decomposition, leading to faster nutrient cycling. So in terms of the corporate world really started looking at regenerative ag and making some bold statements back in 2017. Danone, it's a French dairy company, made a statement back at the end of 2017 that all its French products would be focused on regenerative ag by 2025. General Mills here in the United States made a statement in early 2019 that by 2030, they're going to be sourcing commodities for their different products from 1 million acres by 2030. Again, in North America, McCain Foods, they're primarily a potato company, said that they were going to be sourcing doing regenerative ag practices on 100% of its potato acreage. If you recall, one of the major things of regenerative ag is minimum soil disturbance. I'm not sure how you do grow potatoes with minimum soil disturbance when you harvest them. The other thing is Cargill, at the end of 2020, they kind of one-upped General Mills. Rather than General Mills is 1 million acres, they said they're going to be doing 10 million acres by 2030. So a lot of corporations making some very bold practices. This is the definition that McCain comes up with for regenerative ag. They talk about armoring the soils, preferably with living plants, minimizing soil disturbance, enhancing crop and ecosystem diversity, reducing agrochemical impacts and optimizing water use, ensuring farm resilience and integrating organic and livestock elements. So some similarities with other definitions, but you can see each company comes up with its own definition. Walmart, back in 2020, mentioned that they are driving the adoption of regenerative ag practices over up to 50 million acres and 1 million square miles of ocean, and by 2030, and they want to have zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Pepsico, similarly another large organization, mentioned that their positive agricultural strategy is going to be impacting 7 million acres. Plan is to eliminate 3 million tons of greenhouse gases by 2030. And in 2021, when they made this statement, they said that they had already had 500,000 acres under regenerative ag. Coca-Cola, again, similar large company, their goal was to reduce greenhouse gases by 25% by 2030 compared with their 2015 numbers, and have net zero emissions by 2050. Whole Foods, a major grocery chain, identified regenerative ag as a food trend back in 2019. So you see a lot of these things are being driven by consumers and consumer demand. Ken Giller from Wageningen University in the Netherlands did a review paper that came out in 2021 where he looked at the frequency of different terms were used from different sources, and you can see these bars here. These solid bars are where regenerative ag was mentioned in the early 80s up into the early 90s. That was primarily coming from the Rodale Institute. Then the term regenerative ag kind of waned a little bit, and in recent years it's really been picked up by use, of organizations like the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, as well as some of these companies that we've already been talking about. The livestock sector was a little bit slower to embrace the regenerative ag potential. US Dairy back in 2020 said they'd be carbon neutral by 2050. Then JBS, which is the #1 beef and poultry supplier globally, said that they would be greenhouse gas emissions net zero by 2040. This came out the early part of last year. Middle of last year, Tyson Foods, also another very major poultry as well as beef and pork producer in the United States, said they'd be net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And towards the end of last year, the Cattlemen's Association said they would be striving for carbon neutrality by 2040. Lots and lots of very bold statements here. Another bold thing has been made over in Oklahoma by the Noble Foundation. They're a privately funded research institute based in Ardmore, Oklahoma, basically covering a 100-mile radius from Ardmore, from Oklahoma City all the way down to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They have basically completely switched their focus as of the middle of last year to regenerative ranching, looking at the process of restoring degraded soils using practices such as adaptive grazing, no-till planting, no or limited use of pesticides and synthetic fertilizer based on ecological principles. And so this is a real big thing because the grasslands across the United States, over 650 million acres, a very large footprint. And it's interesting to know that this particular organization, not only did they switch their whole focus to regenerative ranching, but they eliminated a number of their positions, 64 out of their 137 positions, to refocus their efforts. The beef industry does tend to get a bit of a bad rap. The global demand for beef is increasing. However, A lot of people will say that the beef and the dairy contribute a large part of the greenhouse gases coming from the livestock sector, and that beef is 2 to 9 times more, producing more greenhouse gases than other animal products. This is, they often just look at the animal in isolation rather than looking at the animal as, if we think about beef in Tennessee, we've usually got 1 beef cow per 1 or 2 acres. So it's not just the beef cow emitting the greenhouse gases. We have the potential to sequester some of the carbon on that 1 or 2 acres that the animal's living on. If you go to the drier parts of Texas and the Southwest, you may have 1 animal per 50 acres or even more. So this paper here by Cusack in 2021 suggested there's potential management changes that can dramatically reduce these things. Here's some of the suggestion things, looking at different breeds, looking about conventional versus organic production, the grazing systems, the way the feedlots are managed, the changes in fertilizer use and supplements from the feed things. So there's a lot of potential things that we could be doing to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. And when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, the main ones we're talking about are carbon dioxide, methane, which is particularly important with bovines, and as well as nitrous oxide. This is a report that the US EPA puts together. It's an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. And by far the _1 emitter in terms of agriculture is agricultural soil management and fertilizers. You can see this large bar here, agricultural soil management, followed by the emissions coming from cattle, manure management, and other things down the list. If we look at estimates of nitrous oxide, so nitrous oxide is basically a very important greenhouse gas, but it's emitted anywhere we put nitrogen fertilizers down. And it should be no surprise in the Midwest, where we grow all our corn, there's a fairly good tie-in with nitrous oxide emissions. If we look at pastures, pretty much pastures across the United States, there's no real hotspot, except perhaps in the Midwest. You can see a hotspot where the feedlots are for nitrous oxide emissions. Another industry-driven, industry-funded organization is called the Field to Market. They have been instrumental in developing different sustainability indices for industry, and they've got different things going on. They're heavily involved with looking at how do we measure sustainability, how do we estimate greenhouse gas emissions. The United States Department of Agriculture, NRCS, has come up with a tool called Comet, which you put in your different practices, and they come up with estimates of different greenhouse gases. University of Tennessee Extension has been a member of this organization for a number of years. So just to kind of summarize, regenerative ag, it's been in the public very, very heavily in the last few years. I would say that Texas A&M started looking at regenerative ag back in the 90s. They didn't brand it as regenerative ag. Since the last few years, the California State of Chico has got a program in regenerative ag, fairly small program, 2019. In 2020, the University of Illinois actually started a program on regenerative ag. They actually hired a specialist, an extension specialist whose role is only regenerative ag. University of Missouri back in last year started a program on regenerative ag. And as of this year, 2022, University of Tennessee has got a group together. We've actually put out a website where we'll be looking at the different aspects of the mission, the team, talking a little bit about some of the projects, the events that we've got going. I think this is my last slide. So just in summary, what are the future initiatives around regenerative ag? And regenerative ag and climate smart ag are very, very closely linked. So the big question is, what can we do to sequester more carbon? How can we improve our nitrogen management to reduce nitrous oxide emissions? Looking at, primarily the source of the nitrogen, the rates of the nitrogen, how we're placing it, and when we're actually applying it. We've got a lot of work to be doing on looking at different carbon budgets in terms of the carbon dioxide emissions from different cropping and livestock systems, as well as looking at different tools to measure and estimate different greenhouse gas emissions. We know the private sector is working on developing carbon markets. And as with all things extension, there's a lot of potential for outreach and in-service training, as well as demonstrations. And with that, I will stop my screen sharing, and I would like to thank you for your attention. And I will